The desert dusk carried a bitter kind of silence, the kind that sank deep into the bones. The wind scraped along the flats, lifting dust like the restless spirits of all the nameless souls who had fallen out there. Elias Cross rode with his head bowed against the wind, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. His horse's hooves drummed a steady, muted rhythm on the hard-packed trail. He had been on his own for years now, the kind of man who didn't look for company and didn't offer much of it either. The land had made him quiet. Widowhood had made him hollow. He might have passed her by if not for the cry thin, piercing, and small against the sweep of the wind. At first he thought it was a trick of the evening air, but then he saw it. A dark shape slumped in the sand at the edge of the trail. As he rode closer, the outline of a woman took form, sprawled awkwardly, her dress torn and stiff with dried blood. Someone moved against her chest. He was off his horse in an instant, boots sinking into the loose grit as he dropped to his knees beside her. Her skin was hot, fevered. A low, weak breath rasped from her lips. The baby, bundled in what had once been a quilt, but was now caked with dust, squirmed against her chest with a quiet whimper. A bullet had torn through the woman's shoulder, the wound crusted and angry. She opened her eyes, dark, sharp, too full of pain to trust, and looked at him. Not a word passed. Between them, still Elias felt that look like a blade. There was no plea in it, no request for help. But something about it rooted him to the spot. "Easy," he muttered, as if she could understand him. "I got you." She flinched when he touched her, but her strength was gone. He lifted her gently, surprised at how light she was. The baby made a tiny sound, a fist clutching the fabric of her shawl as if refusing to let her go. Elias gathered them both in his arms and carried them to his horse. He wasn't a man who went looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding men like him, especially out here where the law was just a rumor carried on the wind by the time he reached his homestead. The sky was a bruise of purple and gray, the sun long gone behind the distant hills. His cabin squatted alone on the edge of the desert, the nearest neighbor a mile or more away. The place was built from sweat and stubbornness, a single room of rough-hewn timber, its windows shuttered. Against the sand, he dismounted, shifting the woman's weight carefully, pushed the door open with his shoulder. The interior was dim, smelling of wood smoke and the lingering bitterness of old coffee. He laid her down on his narrow bed, the baby still pressed against her chest, and lit the lamp. Its warm glow spilled across her face. Young, though worn by hardship, her dark hair tangled with dust. Her lips were dry, cracked, but her eyes stayed open, following him as he fetched water and tore strips from an old shirt to clean the wound. She never spoke, just watched him, those eyes sharp and unreadable. "Don't know who you are," he said softly, more to himself than to her, "but you're safe here." When he tried to take the baby so he could tend to her shoulder, she stiffened, clutching the child tighter, a flicker of fear cutting through her fevered haze. Elias stopped, raised his hands a little. "All right," he murmured. "Stay still." Then he worked around the bundle, washing away dried blood and grit. She winced, but made no sound. The baby's cries came and went, like tiny waves against the silence. Each sound stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in years, not since his wife's soft voice had faded from the world, not since the nights when their unborn child had never come to draw breath. He swallowed hard, pushing the memory down like a stone into deep water. The next day, the neighbors came. Word traveled fast in places where the wind carried more than sand. Old May and her son from the nearest ranch stopped by first, then Clay Haskins, a man whose grin never reached his eyes. They all wanted to know who she was, why she was here, and whether she meant trouble. Elias stood on the porch, his hands resting on the rail, his answers short. He told them only what he had seen, a woman left to die with a baby in her arms. Clay spat in the dirt. Might be she's mixed up with those Apache raiding parties, or worse. He tilted his hat back, his gaze cutting sharp. "You sure you want that kind of trouble under your roof, Cross?" "Folks around here ain't fond of strangers." Elias said nothing. He wasn't sure why he hadn't sent her along, let her fate be someone else's concern. Maybe it was the way. The baby's hand clutched her shawl, or the way she bore her pain without a sound. Or maybe it was just that he knew what it was to be left behind. When the neighbors finally left, their suspicions trailing like smoke behind them, Elias stepped. Inside, she was awake, sitting weakly against the wall, watching him. The baby slept on her lap, one tiny fist curled against her chest. Elias poured himself a cup of cold coffee, sat in the rocking chair near the fire, stared at the flames. He told himself it was only for a day or two, just until she healed enough to move on. But deep down, something had already shifted. Man could grow numb living in silence for too long. But sometimes, all it took was a single voice, or a child's cry, to wake what had been buried. The days that followed moved slowly, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. The woman slept often, the fever breaking in waves that left her trembling and soaked through with sweat. Sometimes, in those long stretches of fevered half-sleep, she would murmur words Elias didn't understand, fragments of Spanish, Apache, and the soft whimpering sound of a name spoken like a prayer. He would sit by the hearth and listen, the rocking chair creaking under him, wondering what kind of life she had crawled out of. He learned her name on the third day. It was early morning, the air still cool and pale blue with dawn. He had just set a tin mug of water by her bed when her cracked lips parted. "Marisol," she whispered, her voice a rasp barely above the baby's slow breathing. She did not tell him more, not then, but he held on to the name like a clue to something buried. The baby, a little girl with dark eyes wide as moons, was never far from her mother's side. Elias found himself watching the way Marisol's thin fingers traced the child's cheek or smoothed the edge of the faded quilt. It was a peculiar quilt, handmade, rough-edged, but sewn with strange symbols and lines of colored thread that caught the light like stories stitched into cloth. He had the sense it meant something, though he never asked what. When the fever receded enough for her to speak a little more, the pieces of her past came in slow fragments, offered like stones drawn up from a well. Her mother had been Apache. Her father, a blacksmith of Mexican blood who had come north for work and stayed for love. Marisol spoke of a village burned to the ground by men who called themselves peacekeepers, of debts unpaid and warnings ignored. She said little of the men who had shot her, only that they were hunting something she carried, something more than just the baby, though she would not say what. Elias asked no more than she gave. It wasn't his nature to pry, simply listened, letting her voice fill the space that had been silent for too long. At night, when the fire was low and the desert wind slipped through the cracks, he would lie awake on the floor by the hearth and hear her shifting in the bed above him, humming a soft tune to the baby. Her quiet strength unsettled him. He had expected her to be fragile, a broken thing. Instead, she endured every glance of her dark eyes, as steady and sharp as flint. It stirred memories he thought were long buried. He could see his late wife, Anna, sitting in that same rocking chair years ago, her pale hand pressed to her lips as a cough racked her thin frame. He remembered the red stain of blood blooming on a handkerchief, her voice still soft, still gentle, telling him not to worry. But he had worried. And then she was gone, leaving him alone with nothing but a hollow ache in a quiet house that creaked with ghosts. Now, when he caught Marisol's gaze lingering on him across the room, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. It wasn't love, not yet, but the fragile pull of life trying to root itself again after the long season of loss. He didn't welcome it. He didn't know if he could. The neighbors had started coming by more often, drawn by gossip the way vultures are drawn by a carcass. Elias had little patience for them. One morning, as he was mending a bridle out front, Clay Haskins rode up on his big roan gelding, the leather saddle creaking like an old man's knees. Clay was the kind of man who smiled when he was being cruel, and he wasted no time proving. "It heard you took in some stray girl," Clay said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Word is she's trouble, a wild one. You sure you know what you're doing, Cross?" Elias didn't look up from his work. "Ain't your concern, Clay?" "Everything's my concern when trouble's this close," Clay shot back. "You don't know where she's from? Could be she's with them, Apache bands, stirring up trouble. Could be she's bait for something worse." Elias set down the bridle and stood, slow and steady. Didn't raise his voice, but something in his stillness made Clay shift in the saddle. "Go on home," Elias said, his tone flat as the desert floor. Clay grinned, but his eyes narrowed. "Suit yourself. Just don't say we didn't warn you when that girl brings fire to your door." He spat in the dirt before riding off, dust of his horse's hooves swallowing his words. When Elias went back inside, Marisol was sitting by the window, the baby bundled in her arms. She had heard every word he could tell by the tight set of her jaw. Their eyes met, and for a moment it was as though all the distance between them was stripped away. Both of them were outsiders here, bound by silence, by the weight of things they could not say. Elias sat in the rocking chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He wrapped his hands around a tin cup of coffee, holding it until the heat bit into his skin. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Outside, the desert wind rattled the shutters, and the baby gave a soft sigh in her sleep. Elias stared into the fire and wondered if, perhaps, this woman and her child were not a burden, but a mirror reflecting all the pieces of himself he had lost, all the parts he'd thought would never come back. The storm came rolling in from the west, a low, grumbling wall of black clouds that swallowed the desert in its shadow. Elias knew its voice, the deep, bone-shaking rumble that warned of lightning and flash floods, and he worked fast too. Bring in the last of the firewood, his boots sinking in the first slick mud of rain. By the time he bolted the shutters, the sky cracked open, spilling light and water across the land. Inside, the cabin grew small. The wind pressed against the timbers, as if trying to claw its way in. Marisol sat near the fire, the baby wrapped, tight against her chest, whispering to the child in soft tones that barely rose above the rain's drumming. The firelight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow, and Elias found himself watching her as he mended the old rocking chair. And though he could have left it, he felt the sudden urge to set it right. She braided her hair by the fire, the dark strands glinting like wet silk in the shifting light. There was a slowness in the way she worked, an almost ceremonial patience, as if each fold of hair was a small act of defiance against the harshness of the world outside. The hours dragged, broken only by the baby's soft cries and the hiss of rain striking the roof. In the close warmth of the fire, Elias felt the walls between them thinning. He asked no questions of her past, and she offered no answers. But there was a kind of trust forming in the silence, something neither of them said, but both seemed to understand. On the second evening of the storm, just as dusk began to bleed into night, Elias saw movement through a crack in the shutter. A figure on horseback, a dark shape leaning against the wind, inching closer through sheets of rain. His chest tightened. Riders meant trouble in weather like this. No one came out unless they were desperate or hunting. He grabbed the rifle from the wall and stepped outside, the cold rain stinging his face like needles. The rider halted a few yards from the porch, water streaming off a wide-brimmed hat. "Evening," the man called out over the rain. His voice was rough, edged with something Elias didn't like. "Name's Caro. I'm looking for a woman. Dark hair, traveling with a child. She's wanted for questioning about a killing south of here." Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't lower the rifle. I don't know anyone like that. Caro shifted in the saddle, his horse snorting steam. "Funny thing, I heard she came this way. Folks say you've been harboring strays." His eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat. "If she's here, best you hand her over. Ain't healthy to stand between a bounty hunter and his work." Rain ran down Elias's face, cold as stone. He thought of Marisol inside, of the feverish way she had clutched that baby, of the quiet strength in her gaze that reminded him of his own scars. He didn't know the whole story, but he knew enough to stand his ground. "You best ride on," Elias said, voice low but firm. "Ain't nothing for you here." Caro's hand drifted close to his revolver. For a moment, the only sound was the storm, the kind of silence that comes right before lightning hits. Elias raised the rifle, the barrel steady, despite the rain soaking his grip. "I said ride on." Caro studied him, eyes sharp like a coyote weighing its prey. Then, with a slow, mocking smile, He tugged the reins and turned his horse. Desert's a hard place to hide a sinner. Elias stood there, watching until the rider was swallowed by the rain and the horizon. Only then did he lower the rifle and step back inside, mud dripping from his boots. Marisol was standing near the table, her eyes wide but calm, the baby asleep. In her arms, she had heard every word. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elias set the rifle by the door and sat in the rocking chair, his breath still heavy from the tension. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice soft, rough from disuse. Elias looked at her, the firelight catching the rain still clinging to his face. "Because I don't give folks away," he said. "Not when they're being hunted like animals." Something unspoken passed between them then, an understanding. A recognition of two people who had both been left to the mercy of a world that showed none. She nodded, just once, and sat back by the fire, rocking the baby as the storm rattled the roof overhead. For the first time in years, Elias felt something warm rise in his chest. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something like the memory of it, the faint echo of a heart that hadn't given up entirely. The storm passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the rain. Days stretched like rawhide pulled too thin, each one testing the fragile truce between past and present that lived beneath Elias's roof. He found himself working, slower than usual, his mind wandering back to the sight of that bounty hunter's eyes. The way the man's hand had hovered near his gun like a snake ready to strike, Carol wasn't done. Men like that never were. Elias kept his rifle loaded, and close. When he wasn't tending the cattle or cutting wood, he stayed near the cabin, fixing what needed fixing. It gave him an excuse to linger near her, near Marisol, and the child who laughed now, small and soft, like water bubbling over stones. One afternoon, as the sun burned high, he set a worn saddle on the porch rail and motioned for Marisol to join him. Her steps were hesitant, but she came, the baby bundled on her back in the faded quilt. He showed her how to mend the cracked leather straps, its calloused hands moving slow and deliberate, explaining without many words. She watched, then tried, her fingers thinner and quicker than his. When the thread slipped, he reached out to guide her hand, but she pulled back. Her dark eyes wary, to ease the silence, she spoke of her mother, of a braid woven with colored cords and beads, meant for luck, for safe journeys, and strong hearts. As the firelight flickered that evening, she made a small braid from a strip of cloth, tying it around the baby's tiny wrist. Elias watched, the simple beauty of it catching him off guard. Something about the gesture, the way her fingers moved, reminded him of Anna's quiet rituals, the way she'd folded his shirts just so, or set coffee to boil at dawn with a tenderness that needed no words. The memory of his wife was a sharp edge, one he never let himself dull. He had lived alone all these years because the thought of another presence in his home felt like betrayal, as though loving anyone else had erased the woman who had coughed herself into the grave, holding his hand until her breath left her. But Marisol wasn't trying to take that place. She simply existed in the quiet corners of his life, and it unnerved him how natural it was becoming. That night, Marisol sat in the rocking chair with the baby, the fire painting soft shadows along her face. Elias lingered by the door, watching the way the flames lit the small curve of her cheek. "Why do you live alone?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper meant only for the fire. "What is it you run from?" The question struck deep. Elias felt it in his chest like the recoil of a rifle. He could have spoken of Anna, of the empty years that followed, of the way he'd buried himself in the work of survival to keep from feeling the weight of failure. But the words stuck. Instead, he tightened his jaw and looked at her with a softness that cost him something, a look that said, "I am not as strong as I seem." She held his gaze for a long moment, then looked back down at the baby, humming a lullaby in a language Elias didn't know. The next day brought fresh tension. Clay Haskins rode up while Elias was in the yard chopping wood. Clay's face was twisted with that same mean grin, his voice carrying over the dry wind. "You still keeping that wild girl here?" he called, tipping his hat back. "Town's talking. Some think maybe she's got blood on her hands. Maybe she's part of what's got the bounty men sniffing around." "You don't send her on her way?" Might be someone else will deal with her. Elias stood still, axe in hand, his breath slowing. He didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch until Clay shifted in his saddle. Then he said quiet, but hard, "You come near this place again with talk like that, you'll wish you hadn't." Clay snorted but rode off, tossing a glance at the cabin. Marisol was watching from the window, her expression unreadable. Later, as Elias came inside, the room felt different. She was sitting by the fire again, braiding her hair. He sat opposite her, the chair creaking as he leaned forward, staring. At the flames, neither of them spoke. There was too much unsaid, too much fear of saying the wrong thing. But as the baby stirred, fussing in her sleep, Elias found himself reaching for the poker to steady the fire. The small gesture, a man tending the warmth of the home for more than just himself, felt like a promise, though he wasn't sure what kind yet. The day came hot and sharp, the kind of heat that shimmered over the desert like a veil. Elias sensed trouble before it arrived, a tension in the air, as if the mesquite and dust themselves were holding their breath. He was fixing the corral fence when he heard hooves pounding the hard earth. 3 riders crested the ridge. Clay Haskins, his lean face twisted in that familiar sneer, and 2 hired men who looked like they'd done their share of dirty work. Cross. Clay's voice carried across the dry yard. "The time you quit playing. Savior, that squaw girl and her brat don't belong here." Elias straightened, the hammer still in his hand. "You've said your piece before," he replied evenly. "I told you once. You don't come around here again." Clay spat in the dust and swung off his horse, his spurs catching the sunlight. "I'm done talking. You let her stay, you bring trouble to all of us. We'll drag her out now before worse finds her." His hand dropped to his revolver. The baby cried inside the cabin, a thin wail that cut through the dry wind. Marisol appeared at the doorway, her face pale but steady, the quilt clutched around the child. Elias shifted, putting himself between her and Clay. One of Clay's men moved first, shoving Elias hard against the fence post. A fist slammed into his ribs, the force knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled but didn't fall, even as a second blow caught his jaw. Clay drew his pistol, the barrel gleaming, his eyes cold. "Step aside, Cross," Clay snarled. "You don't have the spine too?" The sound of a rifle cocking cut him short. Marisol stood on the porch. The rifle held tight against her shoulder. Her hands were steady, her eyes like dark fire. She didn't shout, she didn't flinch. She simply aimed. "You will leave now," she said, voice low and unwavering. "All of you." For a moment, no one moved. Clay's men glanced between one another, uncertain. Clay's sneer faltered when he saw her finger resting on the trigger. Elias, blood running warm from a split lip, straightened and stepped closer. To her, the quiet force of her presence pushing back at the violence. Clay laughed, but it was hollow. "You'll regret this," he muttered, backing toward his horse. "Both of you will." He mounted up, and with a sharp whistle, the 3 of them turned and rode off. Dust rising behind them like smoke. When the sound of their hoofbeats faded, the world went still again. Marisol's breath trembled, but her hands never wavered on the rifle until Elias gently took it from her. He met her gaze, a silent weight passing between them. Respect, gratitude, something deeper. Inside, the baby's cries softened as Marisol soothed her. Elias washed his face at the basin, wincing at the bruises already blooming along his ribs. When he returned to the fire, Marisol was there, rocking slowly, her braid trailing over her shoulder like a dark ribbon. Neither spoke at first. The firelight flickered across the walls, and the night air cooled through the open window. Elias sat across from her, his body aching. But there was a quiet warmth growing in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He reached out, almost without thinking, and let his rough fingers touch the braid over her shoulder. It was soft, strong, like the woman herself. She didn't pull away. Her dark eyes lifted to meet his, and something unspoken settled between them, not sudden love, but the knowing that they were no longer alone. "You didn't have to fight for me," she said quietly, as if the words surprised her, I think. "I did," he replied, his voice rough from more than the blows he'd taken. I think I've been waiting to fight for something again. The fire crackled softly, the baby shifted in her sleep, and the desert night wrapped around the cabin like a solemn witness. Elias leaned back, watching the shadows dance across Marisol's face, and for the first time in years, the ache of his past felt lighter. Not gone, but shared, and that made all the difference. The first snow came early, soft flakes riding on a wind that carried the scent of wood smoke and distant rain. Elias stood on the porch, one hand resting on the post, watching the pale drift settle over the mesquite and the worn path leading to his corral. Winter had always been a lonely season for him, the silence too sharp, the nights too long, but now it felt different. There was warmth behind him in the cabin, warmth that wasn't only from the fire. The crunch of hooves broke the stillness. A lone rider approached, moving slow, cautious. Elias's hand went to the rifle by the door. It was Caro, the bounty hunter, his hat dusted with frost, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. Caro stopped a few paces from the porch. "Cross," he said, voice calm. "I didn't come to fight. I came with the truth. Your woman, she's no killer. She was marked because she wouldn't lead certain men through the lands her people hold dear. Men with greed in their veins, who want water and gold. They paid me to find her, but I'm not fool enough to do their dying for them." Elias didn't lower the rifle, but his grip loosened. "Then you've done your work. There's nothing more for you here." Caro tilted his head. "You'll protect her then? Even when they come back?" Elias stepped down from the porch, his boots sinking into the half-frozen mud. He looked the man in the eye, the words steady and quiet. "I will. And if you ride back with talk of where she is, I'll be waiting." For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, the wind stirring between them. Finally, Caro gave a faint nod. "She's got steel, that one," he said. "Not many do." Without another word, he turned his horse and rode off into the pale dusk. "Yes," sighed Marisol, stood near the door, the baby in her arms, her dark hair braided and tied with a strip of faded cloth. Her gaze searched Elias's face as he came back inside. He closed the door against the cold, leaning his rifle against the wall. "He won't trouble us again," Elias said softly. Marisol nodded, but didn't answer. She moved to the hearth, where the firelight touched her cheeks with gold, and set the baby down in the rocking chair, the small body wrapped snug in the quilt. Elias watched the chair creak gently as she rocked it with her hand, her fingers brushing over the wood he had sanded smooth years ago, never knowing it would cradle new life. He took a breath, heavy with all the words he'd kept buried. "You don't have to leave," he said finally, his voice rough but certain. This house has been empty too long. It doesn't need to be. Not anymore. Not if you want to stay." Marisol turned, her expression soft but cautious, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe the offer. "As what, Elias?" she asked quietly. He stepped closer, his hand reaching to touch the braid that lay over her shoulder, the warmth of her so close now. "As someone I'd stand beside," he said, his voice steady, though the words were more than he'd dared speak in years. "Not a guest, not a burden, just here. With me." Her breath caught, a faint smile trembling at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't a bright or easy smile. It was the kind of smile born of a life that had known hardship but hadn't forgotten how to hope. "Then I will stay," she said, barely above a whisper. The fire crackled between them, and Elias felt something shift deep in his chest, not the ache of memory, but a gentler weight, something like peace. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Later, when the cabin had gone quiet and the baby slept, Elias stepped outside once more. Snowflakes drifted against the dark sky, catching in his hair, melting on his worn coat. He stood there a long time, watching the land he'd once thought would bury him in loneliness. It was still the same desert, the same endless horizon, but it didn't feel so empty anymore. Behind him, Marisol hummed a low song as she rocked the child. The firelight spilled out through the cracks of the shutters, warm and golden, aglow against the pale sweep of winter night. Elias closed his eyes, let the cold air fill his lungs, and knew that healing was slow, like snow falling over dust. But it was here. It had begun.